Eventually, certain marketing tactics run dry, and in 2025, it's the watch a streamer for a chance to play our new early access game angle. Today, we're talking about Krafton's new game, PUBG Black Budget, their take on the extraction shooter genre, which in itself is a very 2025 move. This has followed a now well-trodden path of announcing a closed alpha playtest weekend, but with no NDA. This means that content creators can stream footage of the game and make videos with no restrictions, but meanwhile, for ordinary people to get a chance to play, you either have to be selected randomly through invites on Steam directly, or alternatively watch a streamer for a key drop. Now, I will admit that the 30-minute watch criteria wasn't actually that onerous this time around, but people are already so burnt out on this style of promotion hyping that they're fed up of seeing another one. Having to watch someone else, specifically streamers who already got access to play the game that you want to play for a certain amount of time before you're allowed to play yourself, has gotten real old real fast. In this way, Black Budget has followed in the footsteps of many other games even as far back as the Cycle Frontier, through to Delta Force and more recently Marathon, which itself was a big marketing fail because of the general reception to it after gatekeeping the access so strongly. So now the waters are basically poisoned for this Drops for Codes campaign already, but to make matters worse, if you are going to run something like this, you'd better make sure that it actually works. After making players sit through whatever holding period you've decided on, forcing players then to link together myriad accounts, Twitch, Steam, Krafton, the latter which they probably don't have, only for the link to be broken and people not being able to get into the game itself, is a surefire recipe for angering a large cross-section of your keenest player base, which is exactly what happened here. It was something like 12 hours later when all of the kinks in the code system were finally fixed, and people did actually get into play at this point. However, this was just the start of the problems. Now, there were a lot of server issues, but that's kind of to be expected. In an alpha test, I can give this a pass. It was frustrating to go into a raid and play it for 10 or 15 minutes and then to just be reset completely back to square one because nothing had registered whatsoever. And I did have that a couple of times, which was frustrating. But there were a few cases where the server was completely unresponsive, yet I was still in somehow because I hadn't been kicked out yet. And it did allow me to just explore around the map, so there was a random hidden side effect. But the part that was much more impactful and had a more detrimental effect on my overall view of the game was the actual performance and FPS. A lot of people really struggled to get this title to perform in a stable way, and one of the biggest issues for me was that my frame rate was so inconsistent. I've certainly dragged my feet on upgrading because I don't really have a streamer PC as you might normally call it. Most people are running the high-end X3Ds and something like a 5090, but I'm still on the old AM4 5800 X3D and a 4070 Ti Super. And in some ways this does mean that it allows me to kind of test more of an average person's experience. Saying that, my PC is still well ahead of the Steam averages, so to only get 85 FPS outside did feel like a bit of a kick in the teeth, especially after other titles have come out recently on Unreal 5, which Black Budget is also on, with over 100 FPS. If it had been 85 FPS stable though, I definitely could have lived with that, that's really no problem for me. But I had some very specific issues where whenever I turned, something to do with the loading of assets, I don't know exactly what was going on, but my frame rate was going down to 55 and also my input lag was absolutely insane. I was trying to figure out what was going on as I played, but getting into various PvP fights, it just felt like I couldn't control my character at all. And one of the worst parts about it is that when I went back to Tarkov, it felt like a breath of fresh air and my mouse was actually connected to my player movements again, which really shouldn't be the case for any new title having Tarkov as its comparison and Tarkov being night and day better. Basically, the performance of PUBG Black Budget in its current iteration is just not fit for a public test, and most people are going to struggle and have a bad time playing this game. And in an extraction shooter, you need to have stable frames and it needs to work at a certain minimum level, otherwise it's just going to be endlessly frustrating and you're going to feel like you're wasting your time. There's nothing more immersion breaking than worrying about whether you've got DLSS set right, what resolution you're on, whether the input lag has gone yet or not, and in this case for Black Budget it definitely spoiled the experience for me. That being said, there were some good and interesting things about Black Budget which we'll talk about first before we get on to all of the other problems. The first being that its kind of unique selling point is that it has 45 players on a big style map. This is sort of akin to the PUBG style that I think that they want to go for, and it does mean that you have more people in there. It's somewhat of a hybrid between a battle royale and an extraction shooter. Again, in a PUBG adjacent fashion, you're also allowed to choose your spawns, which is something that we haven't seen since the early days of Tarkov. The map is split up into these little sections and you can pick which section you want to start in, and given that you have different objectives in different parts of the map, this is actually quite cool and gives the player some agency as to where to begin. You can see sections fill up as too many people want to play in the same area, so you can decide to move somewhere else, which might be further away from your objective, but it gives you potentially a better chance to survive, so you're not inside that initial maelstrom of combat at spawn. More on that later. The map design itself is actually pretty fun, reminds me a lot of games like Far Cry 3, and there's also a smattering of Grey Zone Warfare in there with their kind of sci-fi elements to it. I did get a good feeling of player discovery when I wasn't battling with the FPS, such as finding a little secret shaft down behind a house and climbing down a ladder into a little underground bunker, things like that which felt really nice to discover. Also, if you push your way into the centre of the map, which pretty much seems to be required because nothing on the outside actually really gives you much loot at all, you end up at these kind of compounds, and there's one in particular which has a very big gate around the outside. And when you go up to the door, there's a keycard blocker on there. You need security clearance level 3 or something, which I clearly didn't have. However, if you're a little bit persistent and you keep looking around the edge, you can actually climb over that large fence, which is something that you can't normally do in these kind of games, which did give me that nice feeling of player breaking the boundaries of the game, but in sort of an intended way. Further on from this, we ended up at the main building itself, which also had its own gated keycards, but there were ways in here as well. Using the ventilation shafts, you could get in akin to sort of Metal Gear, something like that. And this all added towards the feeling of being somewhere that you're not really supposed to be, which I thought was quite nice. The progression system is incredibly detailed. There is a lot of modules in their equivalent of the hideout, and although that they started the game off with military-ish weapons, all renamed of course because it's that type of game, not like Tarkov that uses the actual guns, but you start with HP rounds and FMJ and weapons that you broadly recognise, and an armour system that seems to go from armour protection levels of 2 up to 6. But when you look through the research, they kind of go off the end of it even into science fiction, because this is supposed to be a military research base with tech way in advance of what we have now, and there were things in there like level 8 armor, which is based on the research that they've been doing, and energy weapons, presumably to be able to fight people in those level 8 armors. That kind of gave me a cool feeling as to what was to come and sort of drives the progression, but I think they could have done a better job of kind of teasing that and making it feel as if we actually want to go and do it. Unfortunately, the last good thing or interesting thing that I have to say about it is about the way that they deal with the secure containers. So Black Budget doesn't have a secure container by default per se, but what you do have is a drone which can take some items and fly off the map. This means that once you've picked up a few things, you have to choose when to use it. If you find something good later and you've already used the drone, then it means that you can't store that and you have to take it with you and survive with it in order to get it out of the raid. So I quite like that element as mixing it up a little bit. It's a new risk reward that we haven't seen before in these kind of games. There are quite a few good looking things about the game in general, but unfortunately they're just buried underneath a lot of other stuff over the top of them. And this brings us on to the other issues that we had outside of just FPS. In the graphics section, I was kind of weirded out that you couldn't really control the graphics at all. You had a few sets of presets from low, medium, high, and ultra, but there was no visibility into what was actually going on under the hood. And in this day and age in PC gaming, unfortunately, this is actually quite important because different systems work better or worse with different technologies, and the ability to be able to tweak these things to your own system contribute highly towards having a stable frame rate or not, depending on your circumstance and also personal preference. The level of input delay that I was receiving in this game almost leads me to believe that there was some sort of frame gen going on or something similar in the background, because otherwise I just don't see how it's possible for the game to perform so badly on my machine. My fellow podcaster Tara from our ScavTalk podcast also played the game and had similar frame rates to me, but has a 3070 GPU rather than my 4070 Ti Super, which should be leagues better. However, the 40 series has the inbuilt ability to use Nvidia FrameGen inside it, which was one red flag that went off with me as to the performance that I was seeing. There was no option to turn it on anywhere, but also implicitly there was nowhere to turn it off. This is pure speculation on my part, obviously, because I didn't actually check whether there was any FrameGen running, but something spooky is going on. Outside of this, the player's hands just seem way too close to the camera, and there was a slider to be able to adjust this, which after doing so seemed a lot better, but previously it just seemed like a really odd choice to make. Also, a few of the interiors seem to be cut and paste, which again maybe is excusable for an alpha, but if you're going to lay out a house like a residential home and get the players sort of invested in the world and feel like, oh, you know, if a real family lived here and there's like a child's playmat, you can't then just reuse that same child's playmat in exactly the same orientation in another building, because rather than adding to the world, it ends up actually detracting from it if you've already seen that exact scene in the past. Stylistically, there is a lot going on and some very strange choices that have been made. While I do quite like the look of the map overall and the map design, the actual finish of it looks very much like that Unreal Engine asset flip style that we've come to notice from many a game. And without its own unique take on the art style, it does sort of blend into background to all these other free-to-play games that we've seen from less well-funded studios. The HUD is an interesting choice for an extraction shooter. These are normally known for their minimalistic HUDs and kind of immersive and realistic environments, but every gun has a magazine count on the back along with the fire mode and the round inside, so the bullet that you've got in there, whether it's HP or FMJ or whatever, it shows you on the back of the weapon. You've also got the compass, you've got on the right hand side the various things you've got equipped. There are quite a few things going on, and Tarkov isn't completely immune from HUD to be honest, but some of these items do seem a little bit of an interesting choice. Some of these decisions ended up actually hamstringing technical technical features later, which I'll go on to in a moment. But one of the biggest problems that I had about the HUD was almost all of it seemed to just be kind of performative, and the reason for it existing is that when you went into one of the special areas for it to go all jaggedy and staticky, that almost felt like it was more that purpose than for the usability of the HUD itself. Likewise, the PDA map, this has gone for a sort of rule of cool type approach. Rather than it being functional, it's on the back of the guy's arm, akin to some of the early beautiful light screenshots that we've seen. And while that is quite a neat feature, the fact that they've kind of enforced the immersiveness first and foremost forgets that there's actually a player behind the screen. When you're looking at the map, you do actually have to use the cursor to move around as if you're using it yourself with your finger, but sometimes your guy will just like randomly move his arm, and that ends up throwing your cursor off because it's a real player behind the monitor, and you're not actually controlling your character's arm. So it feels like you're not that person, and it really breaks the immersion for me quite heavily, not to mention just being really annoying to use. So moving on from the HUD itself, I did mention that you've got this bullet type which is signified on the back of the weapon. Now this rears its ugly head within the systems because they've decided for whatever reason, and I think it must just be purely for this aesthetic, that you can only have one bullet type in a magazine. And this confused the hell out of me early on. We're using a pistol and I had two different types of rounds with me, Tracer and FMJ, and as soon as I tried to top up the Tracer magazine using FMJ, the game would unload all of the Tracer out of the magazine before it would start to stack any FMJ in, and it became quickly quite obvious that the reason for this is that you can't have more than one bullet type in a mag, because then the indicator of which ammo type you had in your magazine on the HUD wouldn't really work properly. If you're going to make an immersive game that's an extraction shooter, which is a genre that is kind of known for its sort of milsim roots, and then you're going to put mag packing in the game, but you're not going to allow mixed magazines, it does seem like an odd choice. It's like they went halfway and stopped before they actually fully finished the feature. I'd personally prefer just not to have mag packing at all if you're not going to do it well, something like Arc Raiders where the magazines just fill themselves magically. You can kind of overlook that if the game itself is nicely done. It does make it a little bit more casual, but I think you have to decide on which side of the line you want to go. Do you want to have realistic mag packing, or do you want the game to be more casual and you not have to worry about it? On that basis, some of the very simple quality of life things that we've seen in other games that aren't in Tarkov, for example, such as dragging an item onto another item and then swapping around, that works in basically every other game outside of Tarkov, which it doesn't work in because they built it from the ground up in a very rigid way and they can't change it now. But every other game it works in, but it doesn't work in Black Budget, which just seems really weird. A lot of people who were watching me play at the time did complain about the UI looking very generic or copied from other games, and I don't really mind about this because I feel like the inventory in these kind of games has sort of been solved at this point, but there were some unintuitive things, such as there's no second weapon slot, and that is actually on the bag. And this is sort of akin to Grey Zone Warfare, which has the same system, so the weapon goes on the bag itself, but I would say that it didn't make it particularly obvious. I think it's in this game you can put a weapon or a helmet into this special secondary slot kind of slung on the outside of a backpack, but it did take a while for me to figure out that that was actually possible and how that mechanic worked. Similarly to the mag system, where I think they've gone part of the way but not far enough and sort of ended up straddling the line and actually ruining the immersion of the game, is with the health system, where they seem to have gone for relatively complicated armor where you can add inserts and they've got levels and they've got durabilities and they've got protection against different types of attack, that kind of thing, but there isn't actually any modular health system like there is in EFT. Other games in the genre have either just gone away from this, like Arc Raiders. I hate using Arc all the time, but it's the obvious choice given it's kind of the lightning in the bottle game that's appeared out of nowhere. Or you've got a game like Grey Zone Warfare that goes even further than that and takes away health and uses organs and then has a realistic plate system. It feels like what they've done in Black Budget is they've again gone halfway. They've said, we want a Tarkov-style weapon and ammo system, which is more complicated than PUBG, but we're not going to put in the full health system, and you end up in this weird situation where you can shoot somebody twice in the head and them not die, which just feels really awful. And I don't actually know whether there are face hitboxes or not. A helmet might protect the entire head in this game. I haven't done any testing, but it does kind of feel like that might be the case. Everywhere you look, it feels like they wanted to go for something, but didn't quite go all the way, and ended up just making this halfway house where they couldn't quite decide what they wanted to be. Now, earlier I did praise the spawning system about how it is relatively novel in an extraction shooter to be able to pick where you go, and I think that is quite cool. And obviously that works in a certain specific way in Battle Royales, and in PUBG, in its original formulation, you fly in the plane and you land in a certain location, and you're kind of tying up between high risk, high reward, between going somewhere that there's a lot of loot, but you might die straight away, or going somewhere low risk that means you're probably going to stay in raid longer, but it probably means that you're going to get lower loot at the beginning and you're going to have to bootstrap your way up against people who are probably higher geared. This doesn't really work in an extraction shooter because everybody turns up in the raid geared already. If you're in one of those relatively congested spawn points where everybody's picked to go in it and it's full, or even when you're not actually, you can be running into people within 20 seconds because everybody is around the outside of the map to begin with. All you have to do is just cross over horizontally a little bit and you'll probably find somebody, and I ran into quite a few players right off the bat. In a game like PUBG, that doesn't really matter at the start because nobody really has anything. In an extraction shooter, everybody enters the raid geared already, so you have a fight straight away and then you're dead. Even if you win, you've had to expend ammo or resources or whatever, and there's not really been any effort made to try to overcome this problem. Going back to Ark yet again, they're using alternating spawns where sometimes you spawn early and sometimes you spawn late, which isn't the perfect solution, but at least they thought about it. It feels like Krafton have just gone into this game and just implemented it and run into the same problems that other extraction shooters have had before about spawn points, with everyone turning up right at the beginning. So this brings me on then to the PvE and the PvP. So PvE to start with, I just don't think this is very fun. It felt to me like I was trying to play the game and the PvE was mainly just getting in the way. I'd be walking through trying to explore a town and then I'd just have some random big cat just leap at me and just try to fight me, or I'm going through the undergrowth and then a crocodile just suddenly ambushes me out of nowhere. It's not really like I could play around it in any particular way, and I just got jumped upon. They took a million shots to take down, and overall I felt that they kind of detracted from the experience. You've got bugs popping up that are trying to poison you. It's hard to shoot them. You're basically asked to try and shoot insects out of the sky with a pistol. It's not a good way to combat them, and the whole thing just felt a bit random and not very well thought through. On the PvP side, the recoil is extremely high. I can see that some people might like this type of gameplay, but compared to a lot of other games in the genre, it just didn't feel very good. The gunplay was very, very clunky and not particularly intuitive. I started off with the MPX equivalent because I didn't want to start off with the AK-12 because that was the very first character pick, and I thought, well, everyone's going to go for that. I'll go for something slightly different with low recoil that I can use at close ranges. And it didn't help at all. It kicked like an absolute mule and made me question my choice entirely. Some of this is definitely due to the input lag that I was having. That did not help at all, and so I did not enjoy the PvP that I got into whatsoever. But this is a classic thing in extraction shooters, trying to balance between new game gear and end game gear, and if that gap is too wide, then people who are new feel like the gap is insurmountable, and if the gap is too small, then it means that there's no point actually leveling up. So it's actually a very fine balance, and I feel like maybe they've swung too far in the way of high recoil. Another thing where the game's direction seems a little bit confused is the combination of extraction shooter and battle royale at the same time, because they've still kept this element of the circle coming in, and they've made it a bit more sci-fi and a bit more immersive, rather than having it as a completely perfect circle that disappears in, like in PUBG. In an arcadey format, they've made it more sci-fi, so it's this sort of bubble, this anomaly that moves in. And anomaly, by the way, is such an overused choice for the word. Just literally call it anything else. I swear to God, these developers just need to come up with some new names for this kind of thing. But this anomaly, as we call it, moves in an asymmetric way, so it can bubble up into one bit of the map first and then move in another bit secondary, which is kind of okay. But the weird thing about that is that then it takes out the original extract points, which are the boats around the edge of the map. You then have to use wormholes once the map has closed in a certain amount, which are also quite unintuitive to use. There's not really any direction telling you whether they're working or not, especially at first glance. And I think I was a little unfortunate when I met one in the first place, because it was already engulfed partly by the anomaly, and the whole thing was just a graphical mess of audio. The look of it just really did not work for me at all. I couldn't figure out whether I was in the right place, and I did end up extracting, but it really wasn't obvious. The final nail in the coffin, I think, for Black Budget in its current iteration was that cheating seemed to appear almost immediately. I didn't experience any of it myself, but I was in really early, and I also didn't end up playing more than about 4 hours because I just couldn't stand the performance anymore. But I've seen numerous clips of cheaters flying around the map. The appearance of hacks turning up straight away and so early on in a test like this does not bode well for the release of the game, even if it's in an early alpha state. Things like that need to be nailed down. FPS and anti-cheat needs to be there right from day one, otherwise you're just never going to solve the problem, or at least it's an extremely hard uphill battle, and it does not give you credibility to the players who are hopefully going to be playing this game in the future. So yeah, I never want to see any extraction shooter fail, but this feels like Krafton has tried to build up hype too early using a broadly hated marketing strategy for a game that isn't ready for public consumption in an overplayed genre, using the label and IP of another big series that has very little to do with this game in particular. We'll be keeping an eye out on Black Budget, but unfortunately I don't really hold out much high hopes for it at this point.